All right, you did it. You did the thing. You got someone to want to reach out to you. They find and submit your form, but they forget to fill out a field or they don't input things correctly. And if it's not easy to find and fix those errors, people aren't always going to seek you out somewhere else or keep trying the form if they even knew there was an issue in the first place. Errors that are properly written and properly displayed are good for screen reader users, people with cognitive differences, and as always, everyone else. So let's talk setting up the form and preventing those errors in the first place. If you have any general instructions, you're going to put those first before the form and under any heading you might have for that section. So, for example, the most common thing is when you use an asterisk to indicate that one of your fields is required. If you use that asterisk instead of the word required, you're going to need to include a key at the top of that form, stating that an asterisk, means that the field is required. You might also let someone know that all fields are required or optional fields are indicated. Anything someone needs to know before filling out the form. That's going to go above the form. As a quick tip, it is best to use the actual word required next to the fields that are required. So use that method whenever possible. It's the clearest in terms of visually, it's the clearest in terms of the way a screen reader reads out the label, and it's just the most user-friendly and easiest to scan through. If you do decide to use that asterisk, if you can, use it as an image with an alt text of required rather than just using the star that gets read out as a star. Now, when you're adding your individual fields, make sure to include some help text whenever you need to that shows the formatting requirement or describes what's needed. That doesn't go in a placeholder because that disappears when someone starts typing. You're going to put that in a description that is above the field, because when we have browsers that try to autofill or other plugins or browser extensions that try to fill in fields, that drops down below the field, and so it covers that required formatting or help text. Now, you don't want to overdo it. Not every field needs help text, but if it is something that will help someone fill out the field and not have an error in the first place, that's when you're going to want to do it. Now, these descriptions or help text should be visual. They should be able to be seen and not hidden behind some kind of tooltip. Not only are tooltips very hard to get right for when it comes to accessibility, but it's not helpful if somebody can't see it. And they might not know that they need that help text. They might think, oh, if I have a question, then I click on this question mark. And they might think they don't have a question. And so you want to just make sure that help text is visible. It also should be programmatically associated with the input through the tag known as ARIA described by. That's something that your plugin or solution should be including with that help text. You're also going to utilize autocomplete input controls whenever you can as well. And I'll include a link to the list of those that are available to you. This lets the device, whether it's like a phone or a computer or the browser extensions, it lets those things suggest the relevant values based on that information. And it will also sometimes provide a different type of like keyboard. So if you think about a number versus just a text input, that's helpful because if it's a phone number, then it shows that phone number keyboard when someone's on a phone, for example. All of those things are going to help prevent errors in the first place, which is always our goal. We want to have as little friction as possible. So let's talk formatting and required fields and the best practices around those. First, you're going to want to make sure you're not making fields required when they don't need to be. It can be really tempting to just make all the fields required, right? Like, we're including these for a reason. I need you to fill out this information so that I have it. But what's the minimum that somebody needs in order to give you some information so that you can properly answer their request or their message or help them along to find what they need to find? So for example, if you're requiring a phone number, let people know in that description text or that help text what that phone number is going to be used for. Is it actually required? Do you actually need that phone number? Some people may use different phone numbers for different reasons, or be unable to talk on the phone, or require some sort of intermediary when it comes to phone calls. Is this something that you could make optional instead? Can you create a phone field, an email field, and then let somebody choose the best method to contact you and not make that phone number required. And the same thing goes for requiring things to be in a specific format. Is it important for syncing data that they input something in a very specific way that you can check with some JavaScript? Or is it better to provide less friction and accept what they input in whatever format works for them? So for example, we tend to require emails and they need to be in a certain format because maybe we're adding them to a newsletter platform, or we're sending them an email confirmation, or we need that way to reach out to them afterwards. So we need that to be in that email format, and conveniently we have an email input type as well. Think about why you're requiring things in certain ways and do it only when it's necessary. So let's get to testing the form's errors. We want to make sure that we're testing and encountering everything that someone might encounter when they fill out our form, and that we're making sure and double checking that everything is done right. You're going to just submit your form. You want to make sure that you know there's going to be an error, at least one. I would fill out at least one of the fields, because the first thing that you should check for is making sure that any information that you previously entered, even if it was invalid, it should still be there. So by filling out one of those fields, it lets you at least double check that all of the information that somebody has previously typed in does not disappear. Focus should move to the first field with an error. So if you have a few different required fields and you filled in the first required field, but you've left the second one blank, and that's the first field with an error, your cursor should now be on that field. If you have included an error summary as well, the focus should move to that error summary. And then when you have an error message for those incorrect fields, you're going to include that message under each of those incorrect fields. And that message should be specific to the field and provide suggestions for how to fix the error. And we'll go over some examples of what that looks like in a minute. And then the errors should remain there until they've been fixed. You don't want a timer, you don't want them to disappear, and they shouldn't go away when someone starts typing. Sometimes these form solutions will give you the option to validate one of these fields after you've moved on to the next field. So whether you're tabbing or clicking away from a field, it'll sort of validate with some JavaScript and then show an error or not. This is very hard to get right, and it can often be frustrating. So just use caution with that, and we'll go into some of the pros and cons of that in a bit as well. Your submit button should not be disabled at any point, even if there are errors. You always want to allow someone to be able to submit the form. So when you've inserted some values into some of the inputs, but you still have errors, you should still be able to click that submit button. And then if possible, include the error notification in the page title, that text that shows up in the tab of the browser. That's not always an option with some of these form plugins, but if you can, that would be really helpful to let someone know, errors with your forms kind of, inside that page title. And if you have more than a few fields with the various requirements, that's going to be when you want to use those error summaries. And we'll go over those error summaries in a separate video. Now, what makes a proper form error? Well, all of those font and color contrast requirements, everything that applied to other text and things around your site apply to these errors as well. So the color that you use for the error text, it needs proper contrast against the background. Any border color that you use needs proper contrast against, either the page or the input background, depending on how it's set up. And then the font size should be readable. It should probably be the same size as your label, at least. You also need to make sure that you're styling fields that have errors differently. Adding the error message is a big part of indicating that there's an error, but you're also going to want to include something that helps that field stand out when you're scanning the form. So for example, some common ways that you'll see to make these errors stand out include, an icon next to the error message, either an X or an exclamation point inside of that triangle. Adding a wide enough border around the input to make it stand out as separate. Sometimes even adding like a border to the side of the container of that whole sort of label input error message area. The text of that error message should be short, specific to the field that it's referencing, easy to understand, and give proper suggestions whenever possible. So A lot of the form plugins and solutions will default to this field is invalid or this field is required. It really should say something about the field, maybe the label if it's not too long. So for example, instead of this field is invalid, you would say maybe quantity should be greater than 100. So you want to be specific, give them exactly what they need and what the source of that error was. And then, if there's a group of inputs related to the same thing, like if you're using first and last name as separate fields or, month, day, year as 3 separate fields, you're going to use just a single error message associated with all those fields. When it comes to the code for those errors, technically there are some browser built-in methods for displaying errors, but these messages and errors are not fully accessible or user-friendly. So each form or, plugin or solution is going to have to create its own way to handle those errors, which is where most of them run into their most significant issues. Certain types of field requirements should be added to an input when it's rendered, like ARIA required, or using the right input type, patterns, using field set and legend for things like checkboxes and radio buttons. All these things happen before somebody's submitted a form. Then things like error messages are going to need to be programmatically connected to the field that it's referencing. So you do this through things like ARIA invalid and ARIA described by, wherever appropriate. And if they're using that inline validation method that I was talking about before, those error messages need to be tested properly with assistive technologies to make sure that they work properly and don't cause unnecessary, noise to the person filling out the form. You usually won't be able to easily fix these types of problems yourself, so you're going to want to make sure to reach out to the people who created that plugin or solution, and then be prepared to switch form plugins if they aren't able to fix it. So what is the problem with that inline validation method? The first problem is with what it actually means. It can mean putting, the error message near the field that has an error, but it's a little bit more commonly used to describe showing an error as soon as someone is done filling out the input. I've seen so many people suggest this as a blanket way to make forms more accessible without providing any proper context or drawbacks. It is absolutely an option, but just like with everything else, it should be applied to those situations where it makes the most sense. So the best example I can think of is when you're creating a new password. It's going to be really useful to provide maybe that strength meter, whether that's actually more secure is a separate issue. If the password has some kind of requirement, like capital letters or special characters, notifying some of that in the help text is helpful. But then notifying them, as they're typing, or once they've left the field, that could help prevent that additional cognitive load and a better user experience. Though again, the usefulness of those requirements is questionable. But what if someone just wants to tab through a form to get a sense of what's there? They're seeing this form, maybe they're using a screen reader, and so they want to get a feel for, how many fields, what kind of fields are there, what am I going to need to know about this form? Maybe somebody's scrolling down or clicking on something, and then they, move to another field. That's going to trigger a ton of unnecessary errors that are distracting and frustrating. It can be helpful, though, to know what errors might be triggered without having to submit the form and then go all the way back through the form to fix them. And for really long forms, it's important to include relevant headings, which would be an easier way for someone to navigate the form rather than, tabbing through every field and triggering those inline validations. They can, go through the form with the headings, but it's all about balance and what's best for your particular form. If you decide to use this inline validation method, you need to thoroughly test it across all types of technologies. Does it get read out to a screen reader? Is the message that's being displayed on the screen something that is being announced as well? Does it only appear after someone tabs away? Or is it something that happens as someone is typing individual letters and therefore, announcing out to a screen reader every time somebody types a letter? Is it something that is actually helpful for this particular form, or is it a distraction? And is the usage consistent across all types of forms on your site? Now, that doesn't mean you have to use the same method for every form, but is how you're validating these things consistent across all forms? Otherwise, just Wait until someone's decided they're ready to submit the form and let them submit it, and then provide them with the appropriate error messages so they can go fix the problems. Now, when it comes to WordPress form plugins and how they handle errors, for most of the WordPress form plugins, they consistently fall short in certain areas. Some of these issues can be avoided by not using certain field types. So, maybe the date picker isn't accessible. Let somebody type in a date. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to then use that form plugin. You're going to want to make sure you select the right options. Sometimes these form plugins will use inaccessible defaults, but you can easily select the more accessible options. So if something defaults to a placeholder only, you can enable that label. If it defaults to putting the label under a field, you can make sure that you put it above it. Setting the right colors too. Sometimes defaults will have inaccessible color combinations. And so you can, choose the right colors and fix it. So a lot of the things, the places where the form plugins fall short, you can sort of, make better choices as you, fill out your forms and create your forms. But the two areas that you can't fix easily on your own are the markup of each of the fields and how the form handles the errors. And of the two plugins that mention anything about the accessibility of their forms on their own website, only one, Gravity Forms, offers error summaries, and they've turned it on by default too. I asked the other one about it. They said they wouldn't be implementing error summaries because they're already technically satisfying their accessibility requirement with inline errors. So what about you? Do you use a form plugin? Does your platform provide forms for you to use? Have you tested it to see how it handles errors? Are they responsive in fixing any of the things that you find? I've had experience with a ton of these different form plugins, solutions, platforms that provide forms. I'd love to test yours out and see if it's another great option or if it has issues that they need to fix. And like I said at the beginning, handling form errors properly is one of the most important aspects of having a form on your site and making sure people are able to get in touch with you. Make sure that they can do that.